In the cold morning sky over the Yalu River on December 17, 1950, a lieutenant colonel named Bruce Hinton banked his swept-wing fighter into the diving turn his squadron had rehearsed for exactly this moment. Around him, the frozen border between North Korea and Manchuria stretched away to the horizon. Below him, 4 silver shapes were sliding through the cold air, unaware they were being stalked from above. They were Soviet-built MiG-15s, the jets that had shocked the Western world only weeks earlier by outclassing every fighter the United Nations could put into the air. Hinton dove on the lead element. He fired a long burst from his 650 caliber machine guns. One of the MiGs began to smoke and burn. Hinton watched it spin downward, trailing smoke and fire, until he lost sight of it against the snow-covered ground. It was the first confirmed kill of an F-86 Sabre against a MiG-15. And it was the opening shot in what would become the most mythologized air war in American history. Within hours, the news raced back to Tokyo, then to Washington. The United States Air Force had a new champion. The Sabre had drawn first blood against the jet that everyone had feared. Over the next 2.5 years, the F-86 and the MiG-15 would meet thousands of times in the narrow corridor of sky between the Yalu and the Chongchon rivers, an airspace that American pilots came to call MiG Alley. By the end of the war, the United States Air Force would announce a kill ratio that seemed to defy belief: 10 Sabre victories for every Sabre lost. In some publications, the figure climbed even higher, to 14-1. It was a number that came to define a generation of American airpower thinking. It was a number that justified billions of dollars in new fighter programs. And it was a number that, decades later, would turn out to be one of the most consequential pieces of military propaganda the Cold War ever produced. To understand why the 10-1 ratio mattered so deeply, you have to understand what jet combat represented in the early 1950s. The world had moved, almost overnight, from piston engines to turbines. The aircraft of World War II, the Mustangs and Spitfires and Messerschmitts, were already obsolete by the time the Korean War began in June 1950. Jets were faster, climbed higher, and operated in an environment human pilots had barely begun to understand. The Sabre and the MiG were the 2 most advanced fighters on Earth, and they faced each other across a contested border with the entire Cold War balance riding on the outcome. Whichever side could claim air supremacy in this new realm would shape the doctrine, the procurement, and the strategic confidence of every air force on the planet for the next 20 years. The Sabre was a child of American post-war engineering ambition. Designed by North American Aviation, it incorporated swept wings borrowed from captured German research and a powerful General Electric J-47 turbojet. The early F-86 used hydraulically boosted controls with mechanical linkage from the stick. The fully powered irreversible controls and the all-flying tail that would make the Sabre famous arrived with the F-86E variant in 1951. Together, those refinements would give Sabre pilots a precision in the transonic regime that no Soviet fighter could match. The first F-86 Sabres reached Korea in mid-December 1950, just as the Chinese intervention was driving United Nations forces back down the peninsula. They were assigned to the 4th Fighter Interceptor Wing, operating out of the airfield at Kimpo, near Seoul. Almost a year later, in November 1951, a second Sabre wing, the 51st, would convert from straight-wing F-80 shooting stars and join the fight under the command of the famous World War II Ace Colonel Francis Gabreski. Together, these 2 wings would carry the entire weight of the American jet-on-jet effort for the rest of the war, only 2 Sabre wings. That fact alone would shape everything that followed. The opponent they faced had also been born of swept-wing research, but the path that produced the MiG-15 ran through a quieter and more humiliating chapter of post-war history. In 1947, the British government, in an act of strategic generosity it would soon regret, sold a small batch of Rolls-Royce Nene jet engines to the Soviet Union. The Soviets reverse-engineered the Nene almost immediately, designated their copy the RD-45, and bolted it into a new fighter designed by the Mikoyan-Gurevich Design Bureau. A more powerful Klimov derivative, the VK-1, would later power the improved MiG-15 bis variant that did most of the fighting in Korea. The original prototype first flew on December 30, 1947. It was light, brutally simple, and built around firepower no Western fighter could match. a single 37mm cannon and two 23mm cannons, all mounted in the nose, capable of tearing apart bombers and fighters alike with a single hit. Its service ceiling exceeded 50,000 feet. It could outclimb anything in the American inventory. And on November 1st, 1950, when MiG-15s first appeared over the Yalu, they did so with a violence that stunned every Western pilot who encountered them. The first weeks of the air war were a disaster for the United Nations. Piston-engined Mustangs were swatted from the sky. The straight-wing F-80 Shooting Stars and F-84 Thunderjets that had ruled Korean airspace before November were suddenly unable to engage. Even the B-29 Superfortresses, the same heavy bombers that had ended the Pacific War, were forced to abandon daylight raids over the Northwest after suffering catastrophic losses. The MiG had rewritten the rules in a single autumn. The arrival of the Sabre at Kimpo in mid-December was the only answer the Air Force had. And from the moment Bruce Hinton fired his guns on December 17, the contest that would define jet combat for a generation was on. What the world believed, and what the United States Air Force told the world, was that the Sabre dominated this contest from start to finish. The wartime communiques, the press releases, the recruiting posters, and eventually the official histories all converged on the same arithmetic. The 1953 United States Air Force Statistical Digest reported that Sabre pilots had destroyed 792 MiG-15s for the loss of 78 Sabres in air-to-air combat. 792 divided by 78 gives a ratio of roughly 10-1. The Far East Air Force's final report, published soon after the armistice, made the claim official. The 10-1 victory ratio, the report stated, had been gained by superior tactics, well-trained and aggressive pilots, and a superior armament and fire control system. In the years that followed, that single sentence was reproduced in textbook after textbook, magazine after magazine, until it became something close to scripture. Some publications even pushed the figure to 14-1. The number became a foundation stone of American military identity in the early Cold War, and the truth, when it finally emerged decades later, would be very different. The first cracks in the story were never visible to the public. They appeared inside the Air Force itself. Even during the war, intelligence officers at the 4th and 51st Fighter Interceptor Wings noticed inconsistencies. Pilots returning from missions sometimes claimed kills that gun camera footage could not confirm. Aircraft that had been recorded as destroyed were later observed flying again. There were even friendly fire incidents that did not match the official tally. On one occasion, the second highest-scoring American ace of the war, Major James Jabara, fired on what he believed to be a MiG, only to hear the target pilot, First Lieutenant Dick Fraley, calling out over the radio that he was attacking a fellow Sabre. Fraley survived. The incident was quietly buried. But within the squadrons, the gap between claim and reality was an open secret long before any historian would dare to write it down. To understand why the 10-1 figure was so far from the truth, you have to understand the physics, the politics, and the simple human pressures that shaped every air-to-air encounter over MiG Alley. The Sabre had real and important advantages. The all-flying horizontal tail, introduced on the F-86E variant in 1951, gave it pitch authority through the transonic regime that no MiG could match. Below 26,000 feet, it was faster, turned tighter, and recovered from extreme maneuvers more cleanly than its opponent. Its a 1 cm radar ranging gun sight, linked to a small AN/APG-30 radar, allowed Sabre pilots to compute deflection shots at ranges where the MiG could only guess. The Sabre cockpit was pressurized, ergonomic, and equipped with a G-suit that let American pilots stay conscious through high G turns. Soviet pilots, until late in the war, had no G-suit at all. The MiG-15 had its own advantages, and they were significant. Its service ceiling was nearly 3,000 feet higher than the Sabre's. Above 35,000 feet, it climbed faster and turned tighter. Its three-cannon armament was devastating. A single 37mm shell could rip the wing off a Sabre in one hit, and Sabre pilots reported the unnerving experience of seeing 23mm tracers passing above them, while the heavier 37mm rounds dropped beneath. The MiG was simpler to maintain, faster to turn around between sorties, and could be produced in numbers that dwarfed Sabre output. The two aircraft were not master and student. They were rivals of roughly equal capability, each with strengths the other could not answer. The differences ran deeper than performance figures. The Sabre's transonic capability was the product of a single engineering decision that the MiG had not made. The F-86E variant, which arrived in Korea in the spring of 1951, replaced the conventional fixed horizontal stabilizer with a fully rotating all-flying tail, retaining the elevator only as a trim surface and adding artificial feel through hydraulic bungees. The result was preserved pitch authority all the way through Mach 0.9 and beyond, into the region where airflow over conventional control surfaces breaks down. The MiG, retaining a conventional tailplane and elevator throughout its production life, suffered uncontrollable behavior past Mach 0.92. It pitched up violently. It dropped a wing without warning. American pilots learned that they could escape a pursuing MiG simply by pushing into a dive and accelerating past Mach 0.95, a maneuver the Soviet aircraft could not safely match. Many of the kills credited to Sabre pilots in the gun camera footage of 1951 and 52 were actually MiGs that had departed controlled flight on their own, often without ever being hit, and the pilots were credited regardless. There was also the question of pilot survival. The Sabre's ejection seat, while primitive by later standards, gave its pilots a fighting chance to bail out at high speed. Sabre pilots wore G-suits, used pressurized cockpits, and benefited from a radio system that produced clear voice transmissions across the entire MiG Alley combat zone. The Soviet pilots, until late in the war, had none of these things. Soviet G-suits, designated the PPK-1, did not enter widespread service until 1953. Soviet radios were notoriously unreliable, and pilots frequently complained that their wingmen could not hear them at the moment they needed help most. The Soviet High Command had ordered the capture of an intact Sabre as early as the spring of 1951, recognizing that the technological gap in pilot equipment was costing them dead aviators. The order finally bore fruit on October 6, 1951, when an F-86 was forced down on a tidal mudflat along the Yellow Sea coast and recovered before American rescue teams could destroy it. Soviet engineers stripped the aircraft and shipped its G-suit, its radar gun sight, and its hydraulic flight controls back to Moscow for study. But the rules of engagement that governed MiG Alley were anything but equal. The Joint Chiefs of Staff had drawn an invisible line down the middle of the Yalu River. American pilots were forbidden to cross it. Beyond that line lay China, and beyond China lay the possibility of nuclear escalation that no one in Washington was willing to risk. The MiG bases at Antung, Tatung Kau, and Miaogu sat just on the Chinese side, fewer than 40 miles from the river. A Soviet or Chinese pilot in trouble had only minutes to limp home to safety. A Sabre pilot in trouble had to nurse his crippled aircraft back hundreds of miles to Kimpo or Suwon, often through hostile airspace, often with too little fuel. The Sabres flew at the very edge of their combat radius. One squadron commander recorded that his unit was making roughly a dozen dead stick landings every week through 1951 and 1952, gliding home with empty tanks. There was no equivalent risk on the other side. What the American public did not know, and would not know for 40 years, was the identity of the pilots flying many of those MiGs. The communist forces over MiG Alley were not a single enemy. They were three. The Chinese People's Liberation Army Air Force, founded only in November 1949, sent young pilots into combat with as little as 50 hours of total flight time. The North Korean Air Force was even less experienced, but the third opponent was something else entirely. The Soviet 64th Fighter Aviation Corps had quietly entered combat in November 1950, but the Corps reached its peak in April 1951, when its elite formations arrived in theatre. The 324th Air Division, commanded by Ivan Kozhedub, the highest-scoring Allied ace of World War II, with 64 German aircraft to his credit, deployed first. The 303rd Air Division followed in early summer. Together, these two divisions formed the most dangerous single concentration of Soviet air power anywhere outside the homeland. Kozhedub himself was forbidden by Moscow from flying combat in Korea, but his pilots were the best the Soviet Union had. These were the men American Sabre pilots came to call honchos, borrowing the Japanese word for boss. They flew with discipline, aggression, and tactical sophistication that the green, Chinese, and Korean pilots simply did not possess. American intelligence reports from the summer of 1951 began noting that the opposition had become noticeably more proficient. What those reports did not say, because the United States government did not want to admit it publicly, was that American Sabres were now fighting Soviet pilots in Soviet aircraft along the Chinese border. The 1st Radio Squadron Mobile had been intercepting Russian-language radio traffic from MiG Alley since late March 1951. Both the Truman and Eisenhower administrations chose to keep the information classified. To reveal that Soviet pilots were killing American airmen would have created a public demand for retaliation that could have escalated into nuclear confrontation. The Soviet pilots, for their part, operated under their own constraints. They were ordered never to fly over salt water, never to fly within 30 to 50 miles of the front lines, never to be captured. They wore Chinese or Korean uniforms. Their MiGs carried Chinese or Korean markings. They had transliterated radio scripts to use in combat, but in the chaos of a dogfight, they often reverted to Russian and revealed themselves anyway. Both sides maintained the fiction. Both sides knew the other was lying, and in the middle of it all, the actual fighting unfolded with a brutality that bore no resemblance to the clean 10-to-1 narrative the Air Force was preparing for the public. There is no clearer illustration of the gap between myth and reality than 2 days that the Air Force tried very hard to forget. The first was April 12, 1951, a Thursday that became known among bomber crews as Black Thursday. On that day, a force of B-29 superfortresses, escorted by approximately 100 fighters, attacked the Yalu River bridges at Sinuiju. Roughly 30 MiG-15s of the 196th Regiment and the 176th Guards Regiment, all part of Kozhedub's 324th Division, intercepted the formation. 3 B-29s were shot down outright. 7 more were heavily damaged. American Sabre pilots that day claimed roughly a dozen MiGs destroyed. Soviet records, opened decades later, show that no MiG was lost. The United States Air Force halted daylight B-29 missions over MiG Alley for nearly 3 months after the disaster. The second day was even worse. On October 23, 1951, 9 B-29 superfortresses of the 307th Bombardment Wing took off from Kadena Air Base on Okinawa, bound for the new communist airfield at Namsi in northwest Korea. 55 F-84 Thunderjets flew close escort. 34 F-86 Sabres provided high cover. It was, on paper, an overwhelming force. The Soviet response was 58 MiGs of the 303rd Air Division, followed by 26 more from the 324th. The Soviet pilots ignored the fighter escort and went straight for the bombers. Within minutes, 3 B-29s were tumbling out of the sky in flames. 3 more were so badly damaged they were written off after limping home. Only one of the 9 bombers escaped without major battle damage. 28 American airmen were killed. 24 were wounded. Several were taken prisoner. It was the worst single day of bombing losses, in percentage terms, the United States had ever suffered in any war. Daylight B-29 raids over MiG Alley were terminated permanently after that mission. The Soviet pilot, Boris Abakumov, in his post-war memoirs, recorded the satisfaction his comrades felt at having broken the back of the American bomber offensive in a single afternoon. The Air Force, publicly, said as little about Black Tuesday as it could. In the years after the war, the question of what had really happened over the Yalu became a kind of forbidden subject inside American military history. The official figures stood unchallenged. Then, slowly, the cracks began to widen. In 1955, 2 researchers at the University of Chicago Institute for Air Weapons Research, Dennis Strawbridge and Nanette Kahn, produced a study called Fighter Pilot Performance in Korea. Buried in its pages was an observation that should have caused a scandal. Some Sabre pilots, the study noted, had been credited with kills against MiGs that were actually losing control on their own. The MiG-15 suffered from a notorious aerodynamic flaw the Soviets called Velezhka, an uncommanded wing drop that could send the aircraft into an unrecoverable spin at high Mach numbers. American pilots diving through the transonic region sometimes saw enemies tumble away without ever firing a shot. The kills, Strawbridge and Kahn suggested, were going into the official tally anyway. Inside the Air Force itself, the doubts grew. Sometime in the early 1970s, an internal study known informally as Sabre Measures, Charlie re-examined the wartime claims, using updated loss accounting. The exact methodology of that study has been disputed by later researchers. but its central finding was clear. When losses previously listed as operational accidents or unknown causes were honestly reclassified, the wartime ratio dropped to something closer to 7-1. The number was not publicized. The Air Force had budget priorities to defend, doctrines to maintain, and a generation of officers who had grown up believing the original figure. But Sabre measures Charlie was the first internal acknowledgement that the wartime arithmetic had been wrong. The full collapse of the 10-1 myth waited for the end of the Cold War. When the Soviet Union dissolved in December 1991, Russian military archives that had been sealed for 40 years began to open. Western researchers, working alongside Russian historians, finally gained access to the actual loss records of the 64th Fighter Aviation Corps. What they found rewrote the history of the air war over Korea. The Russian historian Igor Sadov, working from the original after-action reports of the 64th Corps, documented Soviet MiG-15 losses with a precision no Western researcher had ever achieved. The Chinese-American scholar Xiaoming Zhang, working at the United States Air War College and drawing on declassified People's Liberation Army Air Force records, did the same for the Chinese side in his book Red Wings over the Yalu, published in 2002. The Argentine researcher Diego Zampini Cross referenced both archives against American records. The American historian Kenneth Werrell, in his definitive 2005 study Sabres over MiG Alley, conducted 60 interviews with surviving Sabre pilots and combined them with newly opened American archives. Together, these scholars dismantled the 10-1 figure. The numbers that emerged from the cross-referenced records were startling. Soviet sources documented 319 MiG-15s lost to all causes by the 64th Corps over the course of the war. The Chinese acknowledged 224 MiG-15 losses and 116 aviator deaths. The North Koreans probably lost between 50 and 100 more. Combined communist MiG-15 losses came to somewhere between 545 and 600 aircraft. American Sabre losses, when reclassified honestly, came to approximately 110 aircraft destroyed by enemy action, with the total Sabre attrition figure, including operational losses, reaching 224. The aggregate ratio, when calculated honestly across all communist opposition, fell somewhere between roughly 2-1 and 6-1, depending on which scholar's methodology you accepted. None of the modern figures came anywhere close to 10-1. But the most important finding was not the aggregate number. It was what happened when the data was broken apart by opponent. Against the elite Soviet pilots of the 64th Corps during the Honcho period, from April 1951 through early 1952, the Sabre fought to a near draw. Modern researchers estimate the ratio at roughly 1.3-1, sometimes even worse for the Americans. Diego Zampini, reconstructing the period from cross-referenced records, concluded that during those 10 months the Soviets actually held the advantage, claiming approximately 142 confirmed United Nations aircraft for the loss of 68 MiGs. The fight against the honchos was not a slaughter. It was a contest between equals, fought at the edge of human and mechanical endurance, with the outcome on any given day depending less on the aircraft and more on who saw whom first. The leading Soviet aces of the war, pilots whose names were unknown to the American public for decades, posted records that rivaled anything achieved by their American counterparts. Captain Nikolai Sutyagin of the 17th Fighter Aviation Regiment was credited by Soviet records with 22 victories. Cross-referenced against American loss records, at least 13 of his claims hold up under scrutiny. Yevgeny Pepelyayev, commanding the 196th Regiment under Kozhedub, was credited by Soviet records with 19 kills. Pepelyayev himself, in a 1993 interview, said he was certain of 12 and probably 15. Modern Western analysis, cross-checking against verified American losses, supports a figure between 14 and 15. These were numbers that placed Pepelyayev and Sutyagin among the highest-scoring Allied jet aces of any nation in any war. They had simply been invisible to the West for 40 years. The asymmetry only sharpened the more closely the data was examined. From the spring of 1952 onward, the Soviet first-line divisions were rotated home and replaced by units drawn from the Soviet Air Defense Command. These replacement pilots had the equipment, but not the experience of the honchos. At the same time, The People's Liberation Army Air Force was throwing waves of barely trained pilots into the fight to gain combat experience. The Sabre Force, meanwhile, had been receiving the new F-86F variant, with a more powerful J-47-27 engine and the new 6.3 hard-wing leading edge that finally closed the high-altitude performance gap with the MiG. The result of this shift was a change in the kill ratio so dramatic that it skews every aggregate calculation. Against the inexperienced opposition of 1952 and 1953, the Sabre achieved a ratio that some historians estimate at 9-to-1 or higher. Lieutenant Colonel Walter Cross, in his 1985 study Military Reform, calculated that during the last 6 months of the war, the ratio was roughly 20-to-1. The high aggregate the Air Force advertised after the war was the average of 2 very different fights: a near-parity battle against Soviet veterans and a one-sided slaughter of Chinese, Korean, and rookie Soviet replacements. There were other factors that inflated the wartime figures. Gun camera footage, which the Air Force used to confirm kills, was often ambiguous. By 1952, official policy had relaxed to the point that any aircraft seen taking hits on film was credited as destroyed, whether or not it was actually observed crashing. The Sabre's 650 caliber machine guns produced spectacular muzzle flash and visible impacts on metal, but the rugged MiG often absorbed punishment that would have destroyed a less robust aircraft. Many MiGs that returned home heavily damaged and were written off in the maintenance hangar were nonetheless counted as flying away by Sabre pilots who had broken contact and could not pursue across the Yalu. The historian Thomas McKelvey Cleaver, in his 2019 study MiG Alley, summarized the standard simply. By 1952, gun camera film of an aircraft not seen to crash was accepted as a kill, and any Sabre that reached its home base, no matter how mangled, was not counted as a combat loss. There was also the question of the border itself. The official rules forbade Sabre pilots from crossing the Yalu. The unofficial reality was that a substantial portion of American kills were scored over Manchuria, in airspace where no claim could be properly verified, and where Chinese and Soviet maintenance crews could quietly tow damaged MiGs back into hangars without anyone in Tokyo or Washington ever knowing what had really happened. Kenneth Werrell's research established that 2/3 of the American jet aces of the Korean War crossed the Yalu at least once, and that all 3 of the top-scoring Sabre pilots, including Captain Joseph McConnell, openly acknowledged it after the war. 8 of the 11 pilots who scored 10 or more kills admitted to flying into Chinese airspace. According to squadron law that circulated for years afterward, Colonel Francis Gabreski, commanding the 51st Fighter Wing, was once seen by his own pilots executing a victory roll over the Chinese airfield at Antong after downing a MiG on its landing pattern. Confronted later about the border violations, Gabreski reportedly replied that if headquarters wanted to discipline anyone for crossing the river, they could start with him. The Air Force chose not to. Flight leaders selected wingmen who would keep their mouths shut. Gun camera film that recorded the wrong geography was quietly lost. Officially, the rules were sacred. In practice, they were honored only when convenient. The Soviets, who knew exactly where the action had happened because their own radar tracked every Sabre incursion, did not publicize the violations either. To do so would have required them to admit the presence of Soviet pilots in the first place, so both sides maintained the fiction, and the kill claims piled up unchallenged. The story of how the myth survived for so long is, in many ways, more interesting than the story of how it began. The 10-to-1 figure took on a life of its own because it served too many institutional interests to be questioned. It became central to the Air Force's case for the Century series of fighters, the F-100, the F-101, the F-102, the F-104, the F-105, and the F-106, each one more advanced and more expensive than the last. It justified the McDonnell F-4 Phantom, the most produced American jet fighter in history. It supported Strategic Air Command's argument that future air combat would be supersonic, missile-armed, and conducted beyond visual range. The lesson the Air Force drew from its alleged 10-to-1 Korean triumph was that dogfighting had become obsolete. The next war, the planners declared, would be won by radar and missiles, not by guns and turning circles. That conclusion would be tested over the skies of North Vietnam, and the test would be a catastrophe. When American F-4 Phantoms began engaging North Vietnamese MiG-17s and MiG-21s in 1965, they did so without internal cannon. The doctrinal certainty that guns were obsolete had stripped them out of the original F-4 design. The Air Force variant with the built-in M61 Vulcan, the F-4E, did not arrive in combat until 1968. Pilots had been trained for high-altitude missile intercepts, not turning fights. The result, as the historian Marshall Michel documented in his book Clashes, was a kill ratio that fell as low as 1-to-1 in some periods of the Rolling Thunder bombing campaign of 1965 through 1968. In one specific tally of 46 F-4 versus MiG-21 engagements during the Rolling Thunder period, the United States Air Force actually lost more aircraft than it shot down. The most advanced fighter in the world, flown by some of the best-trained pilots in any service, was being defeated by an Air Force the planners had dismissed as a peasant nuisance. The reckoning came in the form of the Alt Report, commissioned by the Chief of Naval Operations in 1968 and led by Captain Frank Alt of the United States Navy. The report identified failures in missile reliability, maintenance, and tactics, but its most consequential finding was about training. American fighter pilots, the report concluded, had simply forgotten how to dogfight. The Navy's response was to establish a new institution at Naval Air Station Miramar in March 1969. They called it the Fighter Weapons School. The world would come to know it as Top Gun. By the Linebacker bombing campaign of 1972, Navy crews trained at Miramar were claiming kill ratios that approached 12-to-1 against North Vietnamese MiGs. The Air Force, slower to reform, would follow with the aggressor squadrons and eventually with Red Flag at Nellis Air Force Base, which began operating in November 1975. The training revolution that defined late 20th century American airpower was a direct response to the discovery that the lessons of Korea, as they had been taught, were lies. The 10-to-1 ratio had not only misrepresented the past, it had nearly cost a generation of American pilots their lives. In the decades since, the modern consensus on the air war over MiG Alley has settled into something close to clarity. Against all communist opposition combined, the F-86 achieved an aggregate kill ratio somewhere between roughly 2-to-1 and 6-to-1. The most rigorous study, by historians Doug Dildy and Warren Thompson, places the figure at 5.8-to-1 when the data is averaged across the entire war. The defense analyst John Stillian, in a 2015 study published by the Center for Strategic and Budgetary Assessments, working from a different methodology, calculates an aggregate closer to 1.8-to-1. Against Soviet pilots specifically, every modern researcher converges on a figure near 1.3-to-1, essentially parity. Against the Chinese, the North Koreans, and the rookie Soviet replacements of late 1952 and 1953, the Sabre dominated at roughly 9-to-1. The high overall average that the Air Force advertised was the arithmetic accident of combining a hard fight against veterans with an easy fight against beginners. The 10-to-1 figure that defined American airpower thinking for 40 years has no defenders among working historians today. What did the Sabre actually accomplish over Korea? The honest answer, when the propaganda is stripped away, is more impressive than the myth. The F-86 achieved air superiority over the most dangerous airspace in the world, fighting at the edge of its combat radius, against an enemy operating from Sanctuary, with only 2 wings and never more than 300 aircraft. It protected the United Nations bomber and reconnaissance effort. It allowed the ground war to be fought without persistent enemy air attack on rear areas. It denied the communists the chance to use their numerical advantage in jets to break out of the Yalu corridor and contest the rest of Korean airspace. Those were real and consequential achievements, won by skilled and brave men in superb aircraft. They simply were not won at 10-to-1. They were won closer to 2 or 3-to-1, against an enemy that was often as good as the Sabre and sometimes better. The Sabre pilots themselves understood this. The leading American ace, Captain Joseph McConnell, scored all 16 of his victories in the final months of the war. Between January and May 1953, when the quality of communist opposition had collapsed, McConnell was shot down himself on April 12, 1953, by Captain Semyon Fedorets of the Soviet 913th Regiment. He ejected over the Yellow Sea and was rescued by a helicopter within minutes. 5 weeks later, he scored 3 more MiGs in a single day, and was promptly ordered out of theatre by Lieutenant General Glenn Barkas. McConnell never flew combat again. He was killed in August 1954, testing a new variant of the Sabre at Edwards Air Force Base. The investigation, conducted in part by Major Charles Yeager, found that a missing flight control bolt had caused the crash. He was 32 years old. The most revealing single event of the late war came not from a Sabre pilot, but from a defection. On September 21, 1953, nearly 2 months after the armistice had been signed, a young North Korean senior lieutenant named No Kum-sok flew his MiG-15 south across the demilitarized zone and landed at Kimpo Air Base. American radar at Kimpo was down for routine maintenance. He nearly collided with an F-86 on final approach. The aircraft he delivered, the first intact MiG-15 the West had ever examined, was test-flown at Kadena by Captain Tom Collins and Major Charles Yeager. Their evaluation, when it was published, said something the Air Force did not want to hear. The MiG was a fine fighter. It had genuine advantages over the Sabre at altitude. It was, in Yeager's words, not the wonder weapon Western intelligence had feared, but it was certainly not a pushover. No Kum-sok himself, asked years later to compare the two aircraft, said simply that the F-86 was the better fighter, but that the MiG was good enough to make the contest a real one. The aircraft he delivered now sits on display at the National Museum of the United States Air Force in Dayton, Ohio. The reward No Kum-sok received, $100,000 under a covert program called Operation Moolah, came as a surprise to him. He had never heard of the operation. The Air Force had begun dropping leaflets along the Yalu in late April 1953, offering $50,000 to any pilot who delivered an intact MiG, with a $50,000 bonus to the first defector. President Eisenhower had opposed paying for the operation. The Central Intelligence Agency had advised against it. No defections occurred during the war. But after the leaflet drop on April 26, 1953, the quality of MiG opposition over the Yalu collapsed dramatically. Between May 8 and May 31 of that year, Sabre pilots claimed 56 MiGs destroyed for the loss of a single F-86. Whether the leaflets had caused the collapse, whether the rotation of Soviet pilots home had caused it, or whether some combination of factors was responsible, the result was that the very last weeks of the air war produced kill ratios so lopsided that they distorted every aggregate calculation made afterward. Major George Davis Jr., the only American ace killed in combat during the Korean War, died on February 10, 1952. The identity of the pilot who shot him down remains genuinely disputed among historians. Chinese records credit Lieutenant Zhang Jihui of the 12th Regiment of the 4th Air Division. Soviet sources credit Senior Lieutenant Mikhail Averin of the 148th Guards Regiment. Modern reconstructions raise serious doubts about both accounts. Davis received the Medal of Honor posthumously. He had 7 kills in World War II and 14 in Korea. The fact that historians cannot agree, even now, on who killed America's leading combat ace tells you something about the fog that still hangs over the air war, over the Yalu. When the United Nations and communist negotiators signed the armistice at Panmunjom on July 27, 1953, the air war ended in a kind of stalemate. The MiG-15s stayed on the Chinese side of the river. The Sabres returned home. Both sides claimed victory. The American claim, the 10-to-1 ratio, became the public record. The Soviet claim, that they had shot down more than 1,000 United Nations aircraft for minimal losses, was equally inflated and equally false. The truth, which neither government wanted to discuss, lay somewhere in the middle in archives that would not be opened for 40 years. The story of the F-86 Sabre is not diminished by the dismantling of the 10-to-1 myth. It is, in some ways, made more human. The Sabre was not a wonder weapon flown by demigods against helpless peasants. It was a very good fighter, flown by very good pilots, against an opponent that was often their equal. They won a hard fight. They won it at considerable cost, and they won it under political restrictions that made every encounter more dangerous than it needed to be. The myth that grew up around their achievement was not their fault. They flew the missions, they took the casualties, and they came home with whatever truth their gun camera film showed them. The arithmetic was done by other people, in other rooms, for other purposes. The deeper lesson of MiG Alley is about how military institutions construct their own histories. The 10-to-1 figure was never simply a misunderstanding. It was a number that served interests. It justified procurement budgets. It supported doctrinal arguments. It reinforced strategic confidence at a moment when the United States needed strategic confidence above all else. And once it had been adopted, once it had been printed in enough textbooks and recited in enough congressional hearings, it became almost impossible to dislodge, even by the people who knew it was wrong. The Sabre measures Charlie revision of the early 1970s cut the ratio nearly in half, and almost no one outside the Air Force ever heard about it. The post-1991 archival revolution rewrote the entire history of the air war, and most popular accounts of the Korean War still cite the 10-to-1 figure to this day. There is a final irony in the story. The Air Force institution that worked so hard to defend the Korean myth eventually became the institution that paid the highest price for it. The doctrinal arrogance of the late 1950s, the certainty that dogfighting was finished, the elimination of the gun from the Phantom, the abandonment of air combat training, all of it grew out of the conviction that Korea had proved American technological and tactical supremacy, beyond any reasonable doubt. When that conviction met the reality of MiG Alley over Hanoi, the result was a string of dead pilots, captured airmen, and lost aircraft that took a decade to repair. The Top Gun School, the aggressor squadrons, and Red Flag exist because the lessons the Air Force thought it had learned in Korea turned out to be the wrong lessons. The myth had cost more than reputation. It had cost lives. What the records of the 64th Fighter Aviation Corps reveal, what Igor Saidov and Xiaoming Zhang and Kenneth Werrell pieced together over decades, is a war that was harder, closer, and more honestly contested than any wartime communique ever admitted. The men in both cockpits flew machines they barely understood, in conditions of cold, fatigue, and political restriction that would test any human being. They killed each other in numbers that, when honestly counted, look much more like the ratios of every other air war in history than like the impossible arithmetic the Air Force put on its recruiting posters. 2-to-1, 3-to-1, sometimes parity, never 10-to-1, never anything close to it. The F-86 Sabre remains one of the great fighter aircraft of the 20th century. Its place in the history of jet combat is secure, and it does not require inflated numbers to deserve it. The MiG-15, likewise, was a remarkable machine, and the men who flew it were every bit as skilled and brave as the Americans they fought. The story that emerges from the open archives is not one of supremacy. It is one of contest, and contest, in the end, is a more honest description of war than triumph ever was. History, when given enough time, has a way of correcting the record. It took 40 years to correct this one. The men who flew the Sabres are mostly gone now. So are the men who flew the MiGs. What they left behind, in the archives that finally opened after the Cold War ended, was the truth they had always known and never been allowed to say. They had fought one of the closest jet wars in history, and they had fought it well. The arithmetic that came after them was someone else's invention. The flying was theirs alone.